Okay. So as we gather here today, we acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. If you are not physically in Saskatoon or Northern Alberta, I encourage you to look up and see whether you are actually on unceded territory or in treaty territory. And as we do that, we pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And I do want to say that I grew up in a part of the country where the Indigenous peoples literally saved the lives of the settlers. So we would not have the country that we have today without that background and that good neighborly engagement and teaching of ways of knowing that are quite different from the ones that we arrived with. So welcome everyone, and welcome back to all of our panelists and speakers from over the course of the week. The students in the room will recognize most of you, if not all of you. They may have a little bit of video to catch up on, but that's one of the joys of remote engagement. So welcome back to everyone. I'm gonna just do a little bit of a round table to start to let the panelists introduce themselves and how safety fits into their roles in the workplace or their own history in the sector of engineering, safety, risk management, and so on. So if I could start with Kim, who has the easiest one, Kim Williams from Oventive.
Well, thank you, Dean Kresta. This is pretty easy. My title currently is Vice President of Environment, Health, and Safety, as well as Regulatory and Security at Oventive. And so safety is right in my title. Yeah.
That's awesome. Zenon Kripke, past president of the SESS, past president of CFES, and currently with a company whose name escapes me at the moment. Zenon, could you fill in that blank and tell us a bit?
With Accenture.
Accenture, thank you.
To me, I guess safety, I mean, I've kind of switched gears and I'm a little bit less in the field these days. So I think safety for me is more about ensuring that those around me feel comfortable in being themselves and doing what they need to do in the workplace, be it a physical task or a getting through collaboration and working with others.
And creating a safe space for innovation and creative solutions is really, yeah, that's actually quite challenging. Aaron Janae, are you with Vendasta, right?
No.
I don't have my crib sheet. Geez, Aaron's company keeps changing names.
Siemens.
So you're still Siemens. Go
I'm
for
still
it.
Siemens forever and beyond, I think.
Okay.
Yes. So safety in a workplace that is predominantly occupied by people staring at computer screens rather than actually doing anything physical is an interesting one. And so, however, we have a lot of interaction with customers, and I've discovered this year that part of safety is ensuring that you are safe in your interactions with your customers, which is not something I had expected, but in a diverse crew of people is a high priority.
Awesome. And super, super interesting. Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to move next to Callie Kennedy, who is a project engineer with Delco Water and founder of Life is Worth Living. Callie, please.
Yeah, I think for me, obviously, with my journey with mental health and our nonprofit, mental health safety has always been important. And that's something that I take, I guess, into my work at Delco as well. I am in a bit more of a management role now, so I kind of like to be kind of what Zenon said. I think it's important to have like mental safety, physical safety, spiritual, cultural, all of those things, so people feel safe to kind of grow into their career and the role that they want to pursue. So great.
We were supposed to do 5 words, right? I got it. You're forgiven. Jocelyn Kennedy, who is a registered nurse. Welcome. And
Thank you.
also founder of Life is Worth Living. Jocelyn.
Yeah, so working as a registered nurse, and then obviously the work that we do through our nonprofit, I guess safety for me, one of the main things that comes up in my mind is just taking accountability for your education and your knowledge, and just always expanding on that, and just taking any opportunity you can to learn. That's something that with nursing, the medical field is always changing, so that's something that's critical.
Awesome. And Jocelyn Peltier Huntley, who is currently a PhD student in the College of Engineering. Jocelyn.
Yeah, so I'm an engineering student, but mechanical engineer, and doing some consulting as well, starting a consulting company last year called Prairie Catalyst. And so safety to me in my career is about positively impacting humans and thinking about how we can do things to serve the people that we're working for. So whether that be making physical changes in the workplace or things to help with mental health and making people feel psychologically safe too. That was more than 5 words, sorry.
Forgiven. John Desjardins, and my screen is playing tricks on me. I am going to get back to my bios just a second. John, hang with me for a second. Engineer and General Manager of Great Plains Contracting, also APEG's Vice President at the moment. John.
Suzanne, safety, paramount, performance, culture, accountability, and passion.
Beautiful, beautiful, exactly 5. Great words.
Brown noser.
And I'm curious about the passion connection. It's a Friday afternoon. I have to come back to that one.
For sure. Yeah, yeah, passion, absolutely. It's been, I think, integral, and as it relates to my career. So I came into engineering in 26, and I worked in safety as a safety officer, and started in, I guess, my career essentially in safety. So it's something I think I've weaved, that has been an integral part of everything that I've done since over the last 20 years.
Wow. Think about that for a second. People in the audience, an integral part of everything I've done for the last 20 years. And look at all the nodding heads. Okay. I would say that is a very true statement for many of us. I'm going to catch our last panelist on my screen, Laurie Bradford, professor in the College of Engineering and fully engaged in social and cultural decision-making and engineering design. Laurie.
Hi, apologies for the lateness. I was working on a tri-council committee that went over time. So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm not quite sure what the first question was, or this is just introducing me.
5 words that relate safety to your workplace role.
Sure. So for me, safety means mentorship. It means generosity. It means curiosity. It means allyship. And it means empowerment.
Nice.
Thank you. I am
Very nice.
as a person with a disability, I think all of those things need to be modeled by us as professionals and as academics. And if we do that, we'll encourage the next generation to take on those roles as well.
Awesome. And I'll just put in a tiny plug for APEGA and for professional membership at this point, since Laurie brought up the mentorship line. I actually had a phone call last night from a young engineer who's working in a place where there is no PEng, and they were seeking advice on how to get appropriate mentorship so that they could learn to do their technical work competently. And so it was a really good phone call and a really good reach out to get help in a situation where people could have been put at risk if the mentorship wasn't brought into play. So just a little reminder that this shows up in all sorts of ways and all sorts of places. I want to thank the panelists for a great opening. We've had a few questions submitted from students, and I think we've actually already covered a bunch of those. as we went through the introductions because we shared those with the panelists. I don't see anything coming up in the chat yet. So do remember that you're free to either turn on your screen or put a question into the chat. If you have a specific question you want to put in front of the panelists. I want to put out a question that may be practical and important because we know that the age group from 18 to 25 can be most at risk in the workplace, sort of in their first job, in trying to get things moving to a good place. So the first question is, what do you do when an employer won't fix a safety issue? And I'm going to start maybe with John, because I haven't actually been in the room with John for any extended period of time yet. So I'll start with John and then go to Lori and finish off with Kim.
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, there's certainly guidelines and rules around that, right? Occupational health and safety. You know, we have one of the first things I think we learn in orientations of any industrial sites or any workplaces is our rights as workers. And so one of the first rights that we need to understand is our right to refuse unsafe work. And so if our employer was to ask us something that we feel is unsafe, we have that right to say no and not to do that work, and then to engage and to, you know, to be curious, as Lori mentioned, and to figure out, you know, if there's safer ways to do that. But those are our rights as constituted through Saskatchewan law. And so that's very important for people to know.
Absolutely. Jocelyn, not Lori, but Jocelyn. Sorry about that, Lori.
I think that what John said is very true, that we have that right to refuse. So to have that, and make sure that you have someone that you feel comfortable talking to. And if people are still not listening to you, even though you've talked to everyone, then you can always call a government agency and report it to them too. So if you feel it's really important, you have that right to keep bringing it up and speaking up about it. And that's really important to do, even though it's sometimes hard to speak up to people who have that power over you. It's still important that we do that.
And Kim.
Yeah, I think the points made are great, and that's exactly what I would have said. I think the thing I would add to it is that when you leave the university and become a professional engineer, you'll not only have that right to refuse, but you'll have that obligation to refuse unsafe work, because it puts you at risk. It might be putting a member of your work team at risk. It might be putting a member of the public at risk, or the environment at risk. And so I think I talked about that a little bit in my talk, but rights and obligations, you know, you sign up for big shoes when you become an engineer, and you earn them.
Thanks very much, everybody. I'm going to move to another one, and I'm going to ask people to volunteer for this one. As a computer engineering student, should my only worries about safety be about the ergonomics of my chair and computer peripherals? This is one that comes up semi-regularly. Does anybody want to put their hand up to volunteer on that one? Aaron, and then John, and then Lori, and we will get Lori this time.
Physical threat to you is an awfully narrow definition of safety. It's certainly not the only threat, the only definition that we use in the workplace. And so I, for instance, recently had the opportunity to go to bat for an employee on the basis of a threat that she felt was occurring for somebody who is vetting her, doing a background check for access to a VPN for a customer, where she felt that information had been shared that was too personal, and then the conversation got inappropriate, and she wanted her information deleted from a database. Personal information can be a threat to your own health and safety, both your mental health, but also ultimately your physical health, as it's self-identifying. And so we worked with our customer to get that information deleted. But you can imagine that once you broaden your definition to include a scope, to include an example like that, the scope of concern widens considerably.
John.
Yeah, and so Great question. I think, especially as we start to understand, our engineering practice and our work practice, the application in terms of public safety and safety, I think our understanding is narrow, I guess to say. We don't have that, I guess, breadth and depth of experience. But as we start to work and practice, it really certainly widens that application of safety, our understanding of what safety is. It's truly holistic. And so wearing a regulatory hat, we have an obligation for public safety, right? And so if we're to engage in engineering work, we need to make sure that that work doesn't impact the safety of the public or of public persons, as such the environment. So when you think about, engineering and engineering work is incredibly diverse. There's so many applications where there could be harm. The example that Aaron mentioned, there's certainly harm there. And then safety as well too, not just physical safety, right? We have an obligation, we have an ethical obligation as professionals to ensure the safety of people, and that includes their well-being, right? And so we need to ensure that as well too. So yeah, it certainly expands as we start to practice, we start to understand that application, I think, a little better as we work in the world. But it's more than just chairs and peripherals, I guess.
And Lori, I'm going to let you elaborate on that.
Sure. Thank you, Suzanne. I think there's a big gap in terms of gendered and cultural discrimination in a lot of different engineering fields. If we look right now at the vaccine or the vaccines that have been produced, the dosage that's being administered is for the average North American man. And we're seeing in our statistics that women are suffering worse secondary effects after their first and second vaccines. So a consideration of these kind of safety issues across marginalized populations in everything you do. So, in one example, I was working with an agent-based modeling software, and the options for titles for agents that we were going to make male versus female were different. A male could be a Mr. or a doctor or a professor, but a woman could be a Miss, a Mrs. or a ma'am. So just bringing these things back to the software producers or to other instances are a good example of you considering that safety for marginalized groups. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I'm going to do a quick round table on the next one. What is the #1 cause of injury, I'll say perhaps in the workplace, in your discipline? And so I'm just going to use my screen. So I'll start with Callie.
Yeah, with working at Delco, I would say I used to work at Graham and dealt with a lot more physical safety threats, I guess, at that time being in construction. But at Delco, I'm doing more design work. I would say that the mental and emotional, like stress, managing tight deadlines, would probably be the most common type of safety that we deal with, making sure people aren't burning out and have the support that they need. So that's something that's been really focused on, especially throughout the pandemic, with people not necessarily being together and having that type of support.
Thanks. I've got Jacqueline, they tell me, is the way you pronounce your name, Jacqueline. I'll pick you next.
You're muted.
We didn't hear your voice.
Sorry about that. I will speak to when I work as a nurse. I think the most common injury is when you're obviously moving patients. So it's proper transferring patients. But again, I think it comes down to, as well, just from a mental health perspective, really talking about and reflecting how, like at the end of a shift, how that shift made you feel and what emotions were brought up, say looking after certain patients, and really actively taking care of your mental health.
That's awesome. I am super happy to hear that that's starting to be part of the routine. That's really, really cool. Yeah. Jocelyn, could you speak to your background in mining on this one?
Yeah, for sure. So in the mining industry, a really common one is just kind of slips and trips. It's just people walking from A to B and maybe rolling an ankle or straining a back, doing that, slipping on some ice or a piece of gravel. And sometimes that just has to do with people not paying attention to maybe what they're doing. They think it's pretty simple. They're going to walk across the road or parking lot, and that's sometimes when serious injuries can happen. So it's keeping mind on task is really important.
Amazing. I once had a long battle with our grounds manager at another institution because they had put pea gravel all over the sidewalks. So all the female administrators that had to wear heels to do their job and had to move between buildings to get from one meeting to another, it was like walking on marbles. I turned my ankle 23 times on the way to one meeting. And he came back and said, but it's current best practice. I said, well, airbags used to kill small women too. They're no longer best practice in that form. We need to fix this problem. So sometimes going back to the earlier question about employers not wanting to fix things, even if you have a big voice, you have to persist and continue, and they fixed it. They did clean up the difficult bits. So, you know, persistence is key. Kim, most top of mind from where you sit.
It is super clear in all of our data that injuries to hands are number one in our industry, and that's a result of the very hands-on work that we have in oil and gas. And so most common injury is a pinch finger or a crushed finger, or pinched to the point of very bad, and so needing stitches. And so that's really common for us, and I think it falls under that theme. You're talking about slips, trips, and falls. That seemingly simple task gets away from you, and unfortunately it happens more often than not.
Being present.
Yeah, it's very hard to remind people to do that.
Mm-hmm. Lori, I've got you next up on my screen.
I'm in academia, so physical injuries I'm not sure about. Maybe in lab spaces, maybe burns and slips, and inhalation injuries. But in the social science work that I do, there's often cultural injuries. So somebody will go to do engaged research in a community and use a term that is insulting or discriminatory to people that we are engaging with. And for us as social science researchers, the relationships that we have with communities are like our labs. And when someone comes in and damages that relationship, not only do the communities not get the outcomes they want from the research that we're working together on, but it also is a big risk to researchers, to the university, and the relationships the university is creating, as well as student progress.
That's a beautiful phrase that I hadn't heard before, a cultural injury. That's a really interesting, thank you for bringing that to the table. Zenon.
So I mean, Callie mentioned burnout, and that's obviously kind of one of our, if not our biggest safety concern as well. But I think from burnout, tied into that is actually isolation. So I mean, especially working remotely, a lot of people live alone, and so you feel increasingly isolated, and that starts to affect your mental health. But also, even when we are in the office, I mean, if you work an 80-hour work week, you're not spending any time with your family or friends. And so I think disconnectedness with the people around you. And the other thing that kind of jumped out to, kind of similar to Lori here, is it's a pretty safe space in our company and amongst our coworkers, but there's some clients you can work with where that doesn't apply. And so just kind of, it's almost like when you leave the safe space, you can sometimes be a bit challenged on what you're used to. And so that's a bit of a shock that kind of can hurt some people as well.
That's really cool. Having safe spaces to go back to and kind of get grounded again can be really valuable. And I love the way people are integrating physical and emotional and cultural safety all together. This is a very, very cool group of people that's really bringing that all together. Aaron, I think I missed you.
I thought it was deliberate, that's all. So obviously mental health is one of the issues here, but we do a lot of risk management at Siemens, and one of the key risks that we try to manage is the risk of travel. So a great deal of our work occurs traveling to international locations where we have much less control over the work environment. And the very nature of travel means that, for instance, you're exposed to new microbial invasions and viral invasions that you wouldn't have previously, which is just beginning, I think, to start to make sense to us given how we're handling the pandemic, realizing that this is actually a risk that can be mitigated to some extent, given that most of us actually haven't been particularly sick lately. So wondering what the future is going to hold there is pretty fascinating.
So now I have a really logistical one, and I'm going to focus this one towards Kim and John to start with. What PPE do employers have to provide to employees?
I can go first. So I always answer this in the terms of your employer has, needs to provide you with any PPE that you require for the job that you're doing. And sometimes that's regulated on a company-wide policy basis. For example, at our company, it's standard practice for a certain set of PPE to be worn kind of at all times. But when you go into an advanced situation, let's say into a compressor building where it's extremely loud, then that's when you layer on hearing protection. Depending on the level of noise, you might layer on hearing protection with plugs and with muffs. It's kind of like on top of what our normal level is, there's an advanced level, and that's all provided by an employer in that case. But if I think the question might be hinting at what if your employer doesn't ask for it and explain why and what the hazard is you're being exposed to and why you need protection.
Okay, John?
Yeah, adding to that, right? And so often employers will provide, standard, what we call standard PPE. And so that's eye protection, hearing protection, hard hats, gloves. Quite often though, the expectation is on employees to provide their own steel toe boots so that they can select them fit. There might be a metatarsal guard or different type of expectations around there. But I mean, if people come to site, someone will dig up a pair of work boots that kind of meet that specification or rubber boots or whatever, but that's fairly standard. A lot of places we're seeing high visibility vests as a standard PPE as well too. And so long sleeves in a lot of different sites in construction, a lot of that is pretty standard, long sleeves, no jewelry. It's not quite PPE, but it's safety protocol. High vis vests, hard hats, glasses, hearing protection, impact protection gloves, but we provide most of that with the exception of the boots.
Thanks. Anybody want to add to that? I'm thinking Jacqueline may have another perspective on this because the PPE that she would use has a very different function than impact, and I'm just curious to know what your perspective is.
Yes, I actually, as a nurse, I actually haven't been working over the pandemic. I've actually been on mat leave. Not recently, she'll be 15. Yeah, she'll be 15 months. So I have been off work and I haven't had to be on the front lines for the pandemic, but to have the proper PPE is never like in my job. I work at a cancer center. It has never been an issue. It's always provided. We always have a cart. It's right there. So it's really something that I haven't had to think about, but I know on the front lines when COVID, like last March, when they were debating between the different masks, that was obviously an issue, but it's something that I personally haven't been impacted by because I have been lucky and I've been at home with my daughter.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jacqueline. Okay, I'm going to go to another one that I think is really interesting. What's the most valuable thing someone taught you when you were just starting out that you still think about today, obviously related to safety? So I'm going to start this one with Jocelyn, and then Zenon, and then Aaron.
When I first started working in the mining industry, the site I was working at was over 100 years old. So the standards with how things were built are much different then than what they are today. So when we were looking at how to make things safe for today, oftentimes it was kind of looking back into what was the intent with how things were set and what things do we need to change and what things maybe could we leave or what things did we need to bring up to speed. So there's always lots of conversations around that. So sometimes it was just looking at what if purpose had changed, does it make sense to upgrade something? If we were doing a major modification, then let's make this safer to today's standards, not leave it in 100-year-old standards. So that was something that was really important that I learned early in my career.
Zenon?
I think I learned, and this wasn't one person telling me, but kind of a combination of different opinion or different advices and experiences. But I think that ultimately safety is going to be your responsibility, and you need to ensure that you feel safe, and if not, that you speak up. But then also too, that with that in mind, that look out for the others who are around you, similar in your position, and who also might be scared to speak up, and make sure that others around you feel safe in every form, and not just also well-being and kind of mental health safety as well.
Thanks. And Aaron?
So on the topic of mental health safety, when I first started at my current company, my boss, when I told him I was overwhelmed, said, well, just don't do stuff. And which I thought was a really interesting statement. And I've since learned that, and academics understand this very well. It doesn't matter how deep through that, how far you dig through that pile, there's always pile underneath it. And really your job is always just about prioritizing. And so effectively pulling out the things that are going to have the highest value and doing them and in the time you have available. And so when we talk about prioritizing outcomes over hours, which is a company policy where we are, that's actually that mental health statement. It's like, what we're trying to do is make sure you're working on the most important stuff all the time. And if you're not, and you're feeling overworked, then that's the problem, not that you don't have enough hours in the day or that you need to work more hours. That's had the most profound effect on my own mental health, and it's certainly the piece of information I pass on the most often.
That's a wonderful way to put that. I put it a slightly different way earlier this week. I said, the leadership lesson I keep having to learn is that I have legitimate needs, and when I don't meet them, it just doesn't go well. It just is a matter of time before it starts not going well. And you just have to keep bringing them back into focus because we're such high performance creatures. It's just the way that we love to be is well-oiled machines, and you have to change the oil sometimes. So the focus on outcomes is really, really great. I'm just getting more validation from Zenon in the side channel, and I'm not seeing any questions coming up here from students. John, you want to add to this?
Yeah, I have two things I think that have been incredibly profound in their, I think, influence of how I approach safety, and I learned them. They were taught to me, I think, very early on in my career. One of them was, reaffirming what Zenon said, that I am responsible for my safety as well as the safety of others. And so I can never expect anyone else to take care of that for me. I always have to, participate, right? And then understanding those rights. And then the other thing that was discussed all the time, and it was more of a motto, and it was always discussed at the site I was working at and first started at, was nothing was so important that I couldn't take the time to do it safely. And so those two things have been always, I still say that to this day to the people I work with and everyone that I think I participate in when we think about safety. Is there's nothing that is ever important, and especially to me, that we have to rush through it, that we can't take the time to do it safely. But
thanks. And that's just yes. John, can I put you on the spot as somebody who's been on the floor? And I know how important it is in those roles on the floor to I'm going to say break through a macho culture and bring safety to the forefront. And I want to tie that to a question we had, because I think you'll be able to give us a really great answer here. How does EDI relate to safety in the workplace?
I think, like, you know, especially through, I think my practice and my understanding of that has certainly evolved. Like now I know that they're intimately intertwined, like in EDI and workplace safety, you know, that mental health aspect, certainly an integral part of that. You know, there's concepts and things that people talk about often, and they are toxic. You know, there's a masculinity, machoism in the industrial workplace, in trades and different places like that, that are, you know, that impact that safety, right, and ensure that, or that start to, I think, erode, you know, sustaining those environments where people can feel safe and productive and feel that well-being. You know, they're absolutely, you know, they exist. I think they were much more, I think, toxic when I first started in industry 20 years ago. But they are evolving and they're changing with champions, with change champions. And so people who are, you know, challenging the bias and things like that. And so, and ensuring that people can feel safe, thus feel productive, thus feel, you know, thus produce, thus influences their safety behavior. One of the things we didn't talk about, and this is really interesting, is tying that. We talked about some of those, you know, common injuries that we see, slip, trips, and falls. But I like the discussion, how it's kind of moving around tying the mental health aspect to those incidents. And so, you know, going through the pandemic, as an organization, we're seeing a lot of incidents, right? And so we're thinking, okay, we got to do better hazard recognition. We got to do more. We got to take more time. But what we got to do is we got to engage our workforce in saying, you know, do we feel healthy? Do we feel safe, right? And so, you know, do we feel productive? How are we doing mentally? But yeah, that EDI aspect is certainly tied to it. That toxic environment, you know, we need people who challenge that machoism, right? We think that's what constitutes productivity. You know, we're understanding more that, you know, brute strength, things like that, they cause more safety issues, right? Or what we think is valued in industry. And so, absolutely. And what we're seeing as we engage EDI, I think, more holistically, it's improving safety performance, because we're not taking chances, right? We're not overextending ourselves. We're not, you know, exerting ourselves. We're not trying to do those things that I think, used to celebrate before in industry, that says this is a symbol of productivity, right? So.
Thanks so much, John. And just for those of you joining us remotely, you can sort of see that John might be bigger than me, but he's about a foot taller than me and his shoulders are about twice as broad as mine. And so knowing that he's worked on the shop floor, I also have two daughters who work on the shop floor in industries that have worked out very well for them. But the learning to be a champion, I wonder if I could open that up for the panel. And Jocelyn, I'll warn you that I'm going to come back to you at the end to wrap this up. But I wonder if I could open that learning to be a champion, and on the paths that you've all followed, are there things that you would share with our students that were turning points for you in becoming champions for safety, for EDI, for being present, just for being really all the really great role models that you are? Zenon. And then, yeah.
So what John is saying kind of got me thinking, and this kind of also directly answers what you're saying. I think, I can't remember the exact turning point, but I think in being a champion, and I guess go back, I mean, in being human and being in the workplace, I think one of the most important needs is to be heard. And I especially think, you know, people from, this actually applies both ways in the safety context. I think some people in marginalized communities or who aren't part of the majority, you know, be it visibly or invisibly, it's important that those people especially feel heard. And so I think being somebody who is perhaps part of the visible majority, at least, it's important for me to make sure that the people around me feel that they feel heard. And it's important for me to check up on them, that they have felt heard and gotten to say what they want to say, gotten to be involved, And like an example I use is when I was working at NRL, and I was, I shouldn't say the company name, I was working at an oil and gas company, and I was, there was a couple of us interns, I was a guy, there was a couple of girls, and I always noticed that in leadership meetings, the leaders who were all male would always look to me first for questions. And I had done a little work with one of the other interns, and he asked me first, and I said, well, actually, no, like I'll put past this to her because she was the one who, she'll answer this. And so it's making sure that you're kind of bringing others into the conversation. And I think that needing to be heard too also works from a physical safety standpoint too. I mean, it's important that you're ensuring that that physical needs are also being taken care of and are also being heard.
Okay. Lori.
Thanks. So I think to Elder Gilbert Kiwistep from Yellow Quill First Nation, and he's an elder and a professor at First Nations University. And one of the things that he taught me early on was use your own mistakes as lessons for others. So whenever I go to Yellow Quill and Gilbert's there, he always tells the story about the first time I went there and I said Treaty 6 territory and they're actually Treaty 4. And for me, that was devastating and a horrible mistake to make. But now he uses it as a lesson, and we can laugh about it now. But I think that helps to relax any students or any other people that I bring with me to show the forgiveness that was there and the embracing of the lessons that mistakes provide us.
That's awesome. Callie.
Yeah, so for me, I guess one thing I've noticed since starting in my engineering career is that I have obviously always been really open about my mental health journey, my struggles with my mental illness, and then obviously with the loss of my older sister. And what I've found with that is that it creates a culture in the company then where other people who maybe hadn't come forward for years and had been struggling with a mental illness or their mental health, or had been just living with a mental illness, I guess, finally felt like they could come forward and have open conversations about that in the workplace. And so that's something that's been really important to me, is just, being willing to have those difficult conversations to empower others, because it is something that is so common in the workplace. And if you actually get talking to people, you will realize that lots of times more people than you would ever expect are living with similar experiences to you. And I think it just does a good job of normalizing and also creating a culture where people do feel safe opening up about those experiences they are living through. So.
And that's such a similar theme to what Lori said about openness about who we are creates a safe space for others to be themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Before I go to Jocelyn to tie this down, anybody else want to jump in the middle? Okay, Jocelyn. Oh, there we go. Kim and then John.
I think it's building on top of what it's already been said, 'cause it's been excellent. But we're all really responsible for our own safety, but we're also responsible for everyone around us. And so I think, in my career, I've seen that anytime I've gone into an environment sensitive, maybe it's a little bit macho or needs a little bit of change, it's been about demonstrating my vulnerability and telling stories, like you said, where I've made mistakes. Or, I always keep a picture on my phone of my truck buried up to the rudder in gravel when I've gone off the road, and I show that to people, and usually breaks the ice, right? It's like, I might be in safety, but I'm not perfect, right? And so it's having those conversations with those crews about how can we do better together for each other. And so demonstrating that vulnerability sometimes is all it takes to kind of break the ice.
John?
Yeah, so I guess I have some unique experiences that I think allowed me to empathize, right, with marginalized groups. And so being Indigenous, but also being very fair, right? And I've learned, I've moved away from my home community quite a while ago, lost my accent. But anyway, and I've always enjoyed communicating. But I've been able to kind of sit on the fence in this and really I get to, I guess, see those biases and those perspectives that, maybe someone who looks more Indigenous might not see, right? And so it's I think given me a perspective, you know, to help I think challenge a lot of these things we talk about in EDI. But what it's also I think ultimately done is allowed me to empathize with, you know, with gender issues. It allowed me to understand I think, you know, people of color or Black issues, right, a little more, and so try to relate them to my own experiences to an extent, right, not marginalize their experiences any further, but and thus I think that's what's really empowered me to be a champion for, you know, these people. And so I find myself almost doing, you know, more work in those areas than in the Indigenous space now. I just feel like if real change is going to happen in those areas, it's got to come from people not in those areas, right? And so and I always encourage people to kind of, everyone's been marginalized to some extent, and so we can understand what that experience is and use that experience to kind of teach us that humility that Lori was mentioning, right? So that we can engage in that, learn from that, and then help support, I think, real substantive change in these different issues.
That's an awesome point, John. And you know, I've been pulled into the feminist thing, and it's not a space where I'm really comfortable because it makes me more vulnerable. It might be my beliefs, but I might not want to bring that to the workplace. So I love to champion for other people. Yeah, I get it. And it's all about looking out for each other. So how can we do better together for each other? I put that in the chat because I think it's such a great opening space. All right, Jocelyn, I'm going to ask you to wrap this one up because
Sure.
Jocelyn's PhD is related to creating a safer space for women in the mining industry.
So with being a champion, I'm just going to echo back some of the things I heard, and I might change the wording a little bit, but I think it's all about thinking about the people. So it's all about stakeholder engagement. What do people need? Really understanding why they need it too, so that you know how to advocate, not just knowing that, you know, if somebody needs something, it's like, oh, but it has to be blue, but does it have to be blue, or what are the parameters? So understanding some of those constraints so you can actually support people and advocate for them. Knowing that there's different ways to influence too. Sometimes it's the loudest voice in the room that gets heard, but that's not the only way to make things happen. Sometimes it's having those behind the scenes conversations and planting seeds here and there, and that's what can start to make change happen too. So there's other ways to champion. If you're not, if you're introverted like me and you're not someone who's just going to be out there and loud, there are other ways you can influence people too, to get them on your side too. I think it is really important to make mistakes and allowing other people to make mistakes too. No one's going to be perfect when they're trying to champion for others, and no one's perfect in any day of the week, right? So it's important to allow people to make mistakes and not hold that against them. Really important to show your human side, to be vulnerable. I had one boss and he liked to put on this tough exterior and pretend that he was this tough guy. But then when he started to show his human side, then people actually connected with him more and liked to be around him and wanted to help him and making him look good in his job, right? So it is important that we show our human sides, and that can be difficult sometimes, but that's where that inclusion piece comes in, because if people feel comfortable to be themselves in the workplace, then they can show their human sides and they're going to feel more relaxed and won't be so guarded. And then translating, like John was saying too. So once you kind of understand maybe a marginalized group's perspective on something, you can take that and you can help to translate between different groups that are maybe at a conflict point and help to break down those barriers too. So a lot of it does come down to communication and just making sure people have the same understanding of the terms that we're using and the same definitions, so that we're not both kind of, you know, butting heads about something but really talking about two different things, or actually wanting the same thing but saying it differently. So I think it's through language and through education and through being open-minded that we can help to be champions for others.
Wonderful. Just wonderful, Jocelyn. Thanks so much. So I'm keeping an eye on the time. I've started a practice of finishing events by just staying until the last person leaves the room, because it sometimes brings out quiet conversations that might not otherwise happen. I've also started to try to be mindful to leave people time to stretch and get a break before their next meeting, which usually starts right on the hour. And because I think that that's a healthy practice for all of us. So I want to accomplish both of those things today. And I think we've had such a wonderful discussion. So I want to just capture it there. Before I wrap up, and Erin, I'm going to use your words to close off, so I'm going to hold those for a minute. Are there any other things that we miss that panelists want to bring to the floor? Zenon, and then Jocelyn.
I think one thing that I've been very fortunate to have throughout my time, both in engineering and through my work terms, and as well in my current role, is always having a mentor to kind of ask these kind of questions to. And it's been different people. I've been, again, fortunate to have a lot of people who I can turn to ask questions when I'm unsure of something. And so I think as you progress through your time in engineering and onto industry after, or I mean in between, always make sure you have a couple people in your pocket that you that have a similar experience to you, so they know what you're talking about, and that you can reach out to for advice and for help when anything comes up. That's been something that's been hugely beneficial and helpful to me through my time. So find a mentor.
Absolutely, Zenon. And I'll just add to that, because it's sometimes difficult to get through that vulnerable stage of learning to reach out and ask for help. One of the fastest ways to build trust is to ask for advice. One of the fastest ways to build trust is to ask for advice. So people take that as a compliment because it shows that you think they might be able to help and that you might know something that is valuable to them. And so it is a really great little piece to keep in your pocket for when things get really, really difficult and you do need help. But going to ask for advice drops you away from confronting things. It actually puts you in a position of building a relationship. So it's really, really magical. Jocelyn?
The other thing I just wanted to add, going back to the PPE discussion, is your employer might have PPE standard issue in the warehouse and it might not fit you. As someone who's 5'2" small woman, men's extra small does not fit me. And when I was 8.5 months pregnant at work and trying to put on different size coveralls and PPE, it didn't work. So there are better options out there now. CoverGals is a company that actually makes coveralls for women. And can adjust for pregnancy and that kind of thing too. So yes, ask for PPE that fits you, even if it's not standard issue. So
yeah, and even if the company will pay part of it and you pay the difference, you're still getting the benefit of what the company will pay in order to be equal financially across the board, as opposed to equitable. You still need to come to work and do your job, and you should be able to do it safely because your stuff fits. So it's really great. I just have to share, because I occasionally teach short courses in industry, and I was working this one time with everyone from the plant manager to the operators on the plant floor, and this one guy showed up with this pipe fitter's handbook for me one day, and he says, "Here, I want you to have this. It's the best thing anybody ever gave me." And I'm blown away, super happy, because my students brought me an apple. And I said, "Hey, that's super cool." He says, "Yeah, I have it with me all the time and I refer to it all the time." And I said, "It's about this big and it's sort of a centimeter thick." I said, "Where on earth do you keep it?" And he just is large, guy sized. And he just says, "Oh, I just put it in my pocket." I'm like, my pocket would never fit that book. This is just not going to work for me. So the sizes in PPE cover a huge range now. You can even get steel-toed pumps, black pumps, steel-toed. Super awesome. So I really want to thank all the panelists for joining us today. I hope you've had some fun getting to know each other. I always learn things from the people that come and join these conversations. And Erin has put a comment in the chat. And I think it is so important in terms of what is safety. Safety is about building the community we want. As leaders, focusing on community development and fostering the healthy parts of the cultures that emerge is very important. And it's not something we can do alone. having champions dotted through the workplace that will help people bring their best self to the workplace is so important. We absolutely can't be everywhere. And the minute we stop leading by example, things start to fall to the side. So I really appreciate everybody here taking the time to build a healthy community in the College of Engineering today. And I appreciate all your contributions to the panel. I want to wish all of our students who have been working really hard to fit this in this week, I want to wish you a great weekend. And the weather looks like it's going to be beautiful. I encourage you to get outside and look after yourselves and get some fresh air and exercise. And I invite anybody that wants to stay afterwards to hang out. I will be here until the room empties. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you for
everyone.
having us.